The following program is a co-production of Seattle Channel and Seattle City Club and sponsored by Comcast.
A guilty verdict came swiftly against the officer who murdered George Floyd. But what progress has been made in the pursuit of racial equity?
A lot of self-awareness needs to happen that hasn't always happened in the past.
I think that we've made progress in terms of awareness.
I think the defund conversation has also really kind of pushed the center of gravity.
It's all coming up on Civic Cocktail.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Civic Cocktail. I'm Joni Balter here tonight with what we think will be a fascinating conversation about race and policing in the year since George Floyd's murder. A lot of things have changed in Seattle and elsewhere, yet there is much more work to do to create a more equitable society. With us to discuss this impactful year, including the guilty verdict in the George Floyd case, is our journalist roundtable, featuring Naomi Ishisaka, social justice columnist and assistant managing editor at the Seattle Times, Kurt Streeter, he writes the Sports of the Times column at the New York Times, and Jasmyne Keimig, staff writer at The Stranger. Thank you all so much for joining us. We start with sort of a gut check. How are we as the city different a year after George Floyd's murder? Has there been enough change in your mind? I'll start with you, Naomi Ishisaka.
Sorry. Thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here. I wrote a column this week about a year after George Floyd's murder, and I guess I would say the short answer would be no, and the longer answer would be that I think that while there was a lot of momentum coming off of last summer, as we see so often in Seattle politics, that momentum has kind of slowed, and so now we're seeing kind of a pushing back against some of the more ambitious hopes for the movement for change. But that said, I think there's still progress that's being made.
Jasmine, gut check.
Yeah, I mean, thanks for having me on, first of all. I'm really excited.
Thank you for being here. Thank you so much.
But, I would agree with Naomi. I think that we shouldn't overlook the fact also that, I think the defund conversation has also really kind of pushed the center of gravity, among the left and among Democrats. And I think that it's definitely kind of established itself as being something that we address, but there's definitely not enough work being done. Definitely can acknowledge things that have happened in the legislature, especially, but I think that there's still an overwhelmingly uphill battle for us to really kind of implement real change.
Well, we definitely want to drill down more on the defund. We'll get to that in a second. Kurt, your gut check here.
First of all, I'd also like to say thank you for having me. Appreciate it. And I also want to offer a bit of a caveat in that, since I write about sports generally and nationally, I might not be as in tune with exactly what's going on with the machinations of the latest at City Hall here in Seattle. But I do live in Seattle, and I'm African-American living in Seattle in a long time. A native of this city. I can say that overall, my feeling is that I think that we've made progress in terms of awareness in a heavily majority white city. Awareness among people that have not, many people here in this city have not really paid enough attention to the overall broader issues. And now for the first time, I'm seeing a lot of that in ways that I think are, I look at it as a positive overall, but I'm also not surprised at any sort of backlash or any sort of pushback to change, because that is the history, not only in this region, but it's the broader history of this country. Anytime that there's change and a movement for change that specifically regards African Americans, there you can expect a pushback, and of course that's happening. I think anybody who's astute about this sort of thing would have known and would have expected that there would be a pushback, and we wouldn't have everything that folks were clamoring for last summer. That's exactly where we are.
So Kurt, let me stay with you for a second and ask you this. So what was your best story during this time that you felt, and it could well be sports, something that you wrote that you thought maybe could change or affect the broader narrative of what's been going on this last year?
Sure. Well, I wrote a couple of stories directly related to all of these issues, and again with for a national audience. And one of the stories that I felt really resonated with me and seemed to resonate with Times readers was I went back and I wrote about a high school in North Minneapolis, which is the struggling part and predominantly African American neighborhood in Minneapolis. And I wrote about the coach there who was a longtime police officer, an African American police officer. So he's not only an African American police officer whose father, by the way, is a commander in the Minneapolis Police Department. He's also known as one of the best high school football coaches in Minnesota, and an absolute neighborhood cornerstone, somebody who the neighborhood deeply relies on and deeply trusts, everybody from the kids in the community. He's just one of those neighborhood stalwarts. So I wrote a story. This story was really, about, the tension that he sort of embodies and feels, and all of the pain that he was feeling for his community, for the department and the police department that he's tried to serve as best he could in his own, and that he's tried to change, and knowing too that it hasn't changed enough, and then just trying to keep his kids safe, and being on the front lines as a he had to go down there in the front lines during the protests there, and and as part of the crowd control. And here's this guy who is just beloved in his community, but nobody knew who he was because he had on all of the riot gear, and he's getting pelted by bricks and inside he's, but wait, it's me, it's Officer Adams, and
so many conflicting things for him, so many conflicting parts of his own story there. Jasmyne, what about you? A story where you just said, this is gonna be impactful. This is gonna be part of the big story here.
Yeah, I think that's a really big question. I think that for me, it's not necessarily a story, but my team at The Stranger, we were there live streaming a lot of the protests right on 11th and Pine last summer. And we were kind of really embedding ourselves within a lot of the protests and, taking pictures and trying to report about things that were going on the ground. And, a lot of those videos went viral. A lot of them got used in other newscasts on a national and international stage. And so I think for us and for our team, that's like so small right now. Yeah. It's tiny because of, things that happened with COVID. But I think that our kind of flexibility and our ability to kind of, really embed ourselves in there and kind of use our unique position. Our office was actually right on 11th and Pine. And I spent a lot of my time live streaming out of the building window, which is something I never thought I would do. But it was a really important story for me to try to get out there and be a part of. And I think that it did really shape a lot of cities' responses and a lot of people and protesters' response to see exactly what was going on with the police and the protesters. So for me, it's not like a coherent article or story, but I think it's like kind of a way of using social media and kind of just using body on the ground to tell the story of the protests from last year.
Naomi, you're one piece that just kind of sang for you, and you thought maybe really did impact the discussion that was going on in this community.
Yeah, I covered this a lot last summer, as well as all the time. But I think one of the pieces that really stuck out for me was one that I did in the beginning of June last year that really kind of took a historical look at kind of the contemporary movement, but also in the context of history. So I interviewed Aaron Dixon from the Seattle Black Panther Party, as well as some activists that I've photographed in the past in about the beginning of the Black Lives Matter movement about 5 or 6 years ago. And so to try to make the point that, this is part of an arc of work that's been going on. This is not something that is new to 2020. It might have had a new life in a certain way, but this is like an ongoing struggle that predates, this this past year, even though a lot of people were kind of joining it for the first time. I really wanted to make it clear that this is something that's been a long time ongoing, and that these echoes that we're seeing today, are part of our history and part of our past.
So how are you different? I will just bring this to one person, to you, Jasmyne. How are you different? What are some of the things that happened, experiences you had, or just different thoughts that you had during this last year that you think maybe changed you a little bit?
Yeah, really, really great, deep question that I could probably spend an hour really unpacking. But, I think for me, I'm primarily an arts and culture writer. And so I think even just the experience of doing, protest journalism and really kind of embedding myself within the story. And I think that really shaped the way that I approach writing about people, the way that I kind of approach thinking about the relationship between, the police and art and social justice. I think that really, I feel very, very much changed. I feel the ability to kind of be able to report on things and to kind of contextualize stories like pretty immediately within whatever political context they're a part of. So, yeah.
Naomi, wanted to ask you that, in the heat of some of this, a couple of news outlets started calling Seattle crazy town, sort of painting this portrait of us as this place where everybody's violent and we destroy a lot of property. What did you think about that?
I mean, on top of just the amusement of it, I think there was a kind of a joke in the summer where everyone was like looking outside their house, like, where is this fire that Fox News was showing? It was actually a picture from Minneapolis, actually, so it wasn't actually of Seattle.
As it turned out, yeah.
As it turns out, but I think on top of that, I think that the impact of that has been incredible. Like I get emails and letters from readers all the time from other parts of the country who are like, well, this is what happens when you let, these radical activists, Marxists take over your city. You have, streets that you can't walk down. You've got these fires burning everywhere. The police won't come and answer your calls. And of course, we know this is completely exaggerated, but the grain of truth in it has, people have just taken the ball and run with it to the point where this is just common knowledge that Seattle and Portland in particular are just, unlivable cities where people are fleeing, which of course we know this is completely the opposite is true. But it's just incredible to me how you don't have to actually have any truth for that kind of narrative to take hold and then just become accepted, received wisdom.
Kurt, what do you think of the defund movement? You mentioned that, you mostly write about sports, but in your background, you wrote a lot about police in Los Angeles. Is that right?
I did, yeah. I that was one of my beats at the Los Angeles Times, where I spent 15 years. I covered the LAPD and the Los Angeles County Sheriffs and just law enforcement in general for a time. What do I think of defund the police? I think that it is an unfortunate name in terms of. It's an unfortunate slogan in terms of trying to sell it to a broader audience that needs.
Why is it unfortunate? Does it overstate in some ways?
It's my understanding that it doesn't necessarily mean completely have no police and I think that when you hear defund the police, I think the average. Particularly white American who might be, middle of the road, and the kind of person that you're trying to get on your side thinks that this just means let's not have any police anymore. I don't know exactly what a better slogan would be, but I can definitely see a reexamination of the incredible amount of money that we spend on law enforcement, including pensions that are absolutely out of control, and just the militarization of the police that has happened since 9/11. You can see that in Los Angeles. I was covering the LAPD in the early 2000s, and I saw that clearly not only in LA but in the many small departments that are all around Los Angeles. You could see the kinds of money that they were spending on, basically, military grade equipment. Which to me makes no sense when you're trying to police the communities in American cities. So I think that a reexamination is in order. A backtrack in terms of total funding is in order. I would prefer to see a better, or a slogan that might, to me, hit a little bit more, but I'm not smart enough to know what that slogan would be. But I'm on board for rethinking how we do policing in every way.
Jasmine, is defund a good idea, and if so, why?
I mean, I think I agree with most of everything that Kurt said. It's funny that you said that you kind of had a quibble with the word defund, because I feel like it was a kind of half step between abolish, right? It definitely sounds a lot better, and it is more marketable than abolishing the police, which is what a lot of activists are really on the road of advocating for. But yeah, I think that, seeing the amount of money that goes into police departments, not only in Seattle, but across the nation, and seeing kind of how ineffective they've been at preventing crime, of, at not murdering Black people, and seeing their funding in comparison to a lot of other areas that desperately need funding, like education, like homelessness, mental health outreach. I think that there's so many systemic problems that police can't fight and are actually a part of holding up. And I think that, what this last year has really taught me is that it's definitely possible. I believe in my heart of hearts that it is really possible to majorly defund the police and to really rethink how we police communities. So I'm definitely on board with it.
So Naomi, violent crime is up pretty much everywhere, including Seattle. And so some folks are now making the connection. Violent crime is up. Does it have something to do with the defund movement? You wrote about that, and would love to hear what you think of that.
Yeah, I read about this in my column this week, and I think one of the things that I've heard a lot from my readers is making that connection. So if you're talking about defunding the police, then there's this straight line between defunding the police and a rise in crime. But research actually shows that that's not the case, and the Washington Post wrote a piece looking at the connection between spending and crime, and they found that there wasn't a correlation between the amount of investment in spending and crime. And also the thing that is important to note is that these crime statistics are often very slow to come, and they don't have a universal way to be measured. So it's almost like this correlation is pretty tenuous, but people are making it anyway because they have a particular agenda when it comes to the police defunding question. And to kind of go back to the question you asked, Kurt and Jasmine, I would say one of the challenges with the defunding the police as like a slogan or a way of talking about this work is it's really talking about what you don't want to be versus what you want to be. And I think, a lot of folks are actually reframing it in terms of investing in public safety. And I've been talking a lot about this in my column around, exactly the thing that Jasmine said, like, what would it look like to invest in the things that actually keep our communities safe? And we talk about crime rates. The things that are not reflected there are the amount of investment in things like education and housing and economic opportunity for folks. And those are the things that create the foundation that provide public safety, right? And you can't take those away and then say, okay, we're just going to pull the money out from the police and everything will be fine. You have to actually invest that money in something that actually creates true public safety. And I think that's a conversation we should be having more.
Can I interject?
Go ahead.
And isn't it, now I haven't followed this exactly, on a day-to-day basis, but isn't it true that although there has been an uptick in crime, we're still within a range of historic lows compared to, 20, 30 years ago? Crime is still relatively low. I mean, it's still low overall, even serious crime. And, we got to a point where it had dipped down to levels that it had not been, I believe, since the 1950s. And you're talking about, in LA, I was covering crime and murder, and 5 years or so after absolute peaks of, it was just incredible how many people were being killed in Los Angeles in the early 2000s and 1990s and late 80s. And then we got so low, it's, now there may be an uptick, but I'm very wary of people that are jumping on this rise because we couldn't, it's almost like we couldn't, it's hard to imagine even going lower than we were. Well, I think it remains to be seen where that trend is going to go. And you cannot deny that, to me, that the role of the pandemic and people being cooped up and feeling completely out of sorts and mentally frazzled beyond, and especially people that are already stretched and on the margins. Of course, there's going to be a rise in crime. So to blame it on the defund the police talk, to me, is just
well, to that point, the Wall Street Journal reported last week a kind of counter trend. Just in the most recent months here, police departments in several parts of the country are restoring money to police budgets, some that were just cut last year. Some are even proposing to spend more this year than last. And some departments are citing attacks on Asian Americans and a rise in homicides, which are significant, for the need to do that. What do you think of that trend, Jasmyne?
Yeah, I mean, I think it kind of goes back to everything that we've been saying, is that giving money back to police departments still doesn't really stop the reason why all of this stuff is happening, right? And so, yeah, I think that's a shame that they're kind of using this fear of rising violence to allocate money back to them that had been worked to move out of that. So. Yeah, I think it's definitely worrying. I don't think that it helps move the conversation forward at all.
So I have an audience question from Casey for Naomi. To where do you refer people who want to stay informed on local social justice movements?
Oh, besides reading the Seattle Times, of course.
Of course. we allow really quick ads.
I try to read and consume as much media as I can. So I've been loving the addition of Converge to the local media landscape. I watched their show and really grateful for that reporting. The South Seattle Emerald, of course. I think that there's all these different groups like King County Equity Now, Decriminalize Seattle, that put out their own blogs and their own messages that are always really interesting. And then, on the other side of the spectrum is outlets like the Post Millennial, which I also read just to kind of keep up with, what is being said over there. And that's a lot of places where you kind of see this sort of crazy town type narrative. But try to absorb it all to kind of see where the truth is in all of it.
So I'd like to zoom in for a second here on the East Precinct. And Jasmyne, you were talking about some of the coverage that you were doing, literally leaning out the window, live streaming what was happening there. Tell us a little bit more about sort of how that, and there were some other journalists, were there not, that were maybe camping out with you folks, how that sort of affected how you approached the story. You were watching it just many, many nights, you told me.
Yeah. Well, I think the East Precinct really, to me, surprisingly became the kind of point of conflict throughout that kind of first week before CHOP was formed. And I think there was a lot of different reasons for that. Durkin had issued a nightly curfew that had encompassed the entire city, and it extended from 5 a.m. To 5 p.m. and then 5 a.m. to 9 p.m. And so, that first Saturday where, a bunch of protesters had congregated at Westlake, and that image of the police car on fire, that's where that came from. After that night, we kind of saw a lot more protests happening outside of downtown. And partially, I think it was because of that curfew, but it was also because the police had really been pushing protesters up the hill. And, there's actually this Good Como News article that actually kind of cited Best as allowing, protesters to kind of come up to the East Precinct. And so I think, the curfew and then the kind of police movements pushing protesters up, the existence of Cal Anderson, which is a super great meeting spot and kind of convening spot for people to come together. And I think also the pink umbrella incident, and that viral moment where, you see an SPD officer and a protester kind of fighting over a pink umbrella. And then you kind of see like the spraying that went on, the blast balls. And that moment went really viral. and that was on like the second or third day of the major protests that went on in Seattle. And I think that the combination of all of those things really kind of galvanized a lot of support at the East Precinct. And so it was really interesting to kind of sit above all of that and watch night after night, protesters come and kind of convene and organize, and also just watching the police movements. And then again, like you said, we shared that newsroom with people from Reuters, people from the Seattle Times. I think that there's this kind of spirit, that I hadn't seen before of, journalists really coming out and supporting each other and making sure that each other were really safe at a time where it felt very dangerous, with glass balls flying like left and right and tear gas. And so it felt like a really good opportunity for the kind of Seattle media to come together and really kind of, share resources at a time when, we're pretty decimated.
So Naomi, I don't know if you saw it, the former chief Carmen Best gave an interview this week in which she said that closing the East Precinct would be a threat to public safety. What did you think of that?
Sorry, I didn't see that interview, but I'm not surprised that she would have that position. And I know that there's a lot of folks in the community, particularly elders, who feel very strongly that that precinct was a hard-fought win for the Black community, and that they feel like the efforts to kind of remove it or get rid of it are kind of a slap in their face. I think that there's somewhat of a generational divide around that, and I think that there's probably going to need to be a lot of work to do to bridge those perspectives. And I've heard a lot of conversations about this in the community, and a lot of tension between some of the younger activists and some of the elders who did push hard to get that precinct put in that location.
So Kurt, how do protests in sports, something that you're very familiar with, actually impact the Black Lives Matter movement? How did you see maybe some of the protests you've covered or written about? How did they actually impact what was happening elsewhere?
Well, it all fed off of each other. The movement, and then particularly the protests that happened last summer when the NBA players first walked out during the NBA playoffs, which were in the bubble and down in Orlando, and then that was followed by leagues all over the country walking out, and then the WNBA walking out, and just an incredibly strong stand. And then it spread to Europe, and then you'd see protests, Black Lives Matter protests in sports, and rugby in New Zealand and Australia, and it just all, the narrative then just went in a circular fashion, because the athletes today are seen as, they're such cultural icons and signposts that what they say and what they do really matters, and that people listen, people stand up, and they pay attention. And when they see LeBron James speaking out about these issues, or Serena Williams speaking out about it, it just adds, it heartens the movement. It also then adds to people who are not necessarily on board with the movement, and think that sports needs to be completely devoid of politics or any sort of social critique. So sort of then you see sort of sports becoming this area where that's fought over both by people on the right and people on the left. With the athletes, then the athletes and athlete empowerment has become a real thing in a way I think that we've never really seen before, even in the 1960s and early 70s, when there was a lot of activism. But this
is their involvement, as you said, circular, or does it sometimes actually change the discussion that's going on? Do they actually impact the whole discussion?
I think that's really hard to tease out. It changes I'll tell you one thing. They can make some real waves politically, and I wrote about the Atlanta Dream, the WNBA team, and the WNBA at large, an incredible league in terms of social activism, more involved in activism, more involved in the outside world than any other league in the world. Is the WNBA, and the team, the Atlanta Dream, which was owned by Kelly Loeffler, who was a Republican senator who strongly sided with President Trump at the time. Well, the WNBA didn't exactly like, the players didn't like that. The Dream players certainly didn't like that. And they fought against her in a way that had never happened before in terms of athlete involvement in politics. And they were, nobody would say that they were the absolute reason that Kelly Loeffler lost to now Senator Warnock in Georgia, but they were absolutely a significant force. And if you have people like me in the New York Times writing about their movement, that probably only helps them.
So Naomi, and you're on behalf of the Seattle Times, I guess, in this regard. How do you choose what to cover? Think about it. In our own backyard, we had the Manny Ellis case. This happened a couple months before George Floyd. Why didn't the Tacoma case, do you think, generate as much attention, as much national attention as the George Floyd case?
You know, I've been wondering that question for over a year. I have long thought that it was undercovered, under-recognized. I think, you know, if I were to hypothesize, I think that the decline in local media has had an impact on that. The Tacoma News Tribune, where I used to work many moons ago, is, you know, just a fraction of its former self. And so the resources aren't as much there in you know, South Sound as they might have been in the past. And I think they're all the exact same, and I've written about this multiple times, but all the exact same scenarios, pretty much, except for a video camera rolling, were present with the Manny Ellis case, right? And so there's all these parallels, but the country has no idea who Manny Ellis is.
Well, so Jasmine, I want to ask about that. You know, the case wasn't even covered that much locally. And so that makes me wonder, you know, is it all about the video? Like, if you have a great video, then you get the national attention, then everybody covers it. And, you know, there was a video, but it wasn't the same quality. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's also something, the spectacle of Black Death too is certainly a part of that. And yeah, I do think having the availability of people seeing it makes it more real for them, or something. I don't really quite understand that connection either. But I think also the fact that it was handled a lot differently by Tacoma PD. You know, there was a lot of confusion, or, you know, on purpose around what exactly happened. Tacoma PD really framed Manny Ellis in a way that I don't think the Minnesota police did for George Floyd. And I think because there was that kind of arresting video and really kind of traumatic video associated with George Floyd's murder, I think that kind of what elevated it, you know, to a national conversation.
Kurt, I'd like to know, just looking ahead, you know, where do we go, and how do we grow in the year ahead? How do we know that we are making progress in the future?
Wow.
Well, I mean, what would it look like? What would progress look like?
I think progress would look like us continuing to, well, of course, continuing to push for change, you know, and I mean, I want to see a society and a culture that's starting to come to grips with the misinformation and the poor information that almost half of the population is feeding off of. And I would like to see, I don't know exactly how to do that, but change to me would be when real change in our culture would be a first step, an important first step would be to grapple with that, with information that is absolutely not factual and that's being pushed out there on half the population, or roughly half, and so many people are buying into it. It's fine to quibble with maybe some of the things that I say as a columnist, or as a, you know, and I'm you know, but our news, the basic facts, the fact that we've strayed from a place where we can't even agree on basic facts, and so many people are just getting information that's, you know, they're just being toyed with. I want to see that tackled, and that's the first step.
Well, while I have you, I have an audience question from Jeff for Kurt. Do you think sports stars will continue to kneel during the national anthem? Is this
Yeah.
the legacy of Colin Kaepernick? What do you think?
They already are not. You don't see them. They're doing it. Doing it a little bit. I just watched an English football game, just a couple. It was soccer in our parlance, a couple weeks ago, and it was interesting to see that in Europe they're still kneeling before. They're actually kneeling before games. Entire teams, white and black and Asian all together, and Latino as well, all together kneeling. But you're actually seeing less and less of that here in America, and what's happened is the big leagues have sort of co-opted the message, and their corporatization. There's been a corporatization of the message in some sense. Say the NFL and the NBA have both done that, and they're tamping down. They're kind of quietly trying to now move beyond slogans on jerseys and slogans on courts and kneeling and protest. So it's going to be interesting to see how much that actually continues. I think that you can still be effective without doing it, though. There's two ways of making change. You can make change in those very bold signpost sort of ways, where you can make change behind the scenes. And I think right now some of the movement now is going behind the scenes to make change. So that's what the players are, I think, focusing on right now.
So jump ball, whoever wants this one. How do white journalists like myself reveal that we don't really get it? We don't know what it's like to actually be in your shoes. Who wants this one? I'm game. Okay.
I mean, it's a basic, to me, it's just basic journalism. You just have empathy for, you just show, let's say you're out in the field and you're reporting, you just have empathy and an openness to your subjects, the same way that we do, journalists of color do, when we go out and we report on people all the time who don't look or have anything in their background that's even remotely like us. And yet we show that we care. We show that we take them seriously. We show that we can try our best to understand their position and oftentimes their plight. It's the most important thing to me as a journalist is empathy. And I think if you're a white reporter and you're looking to show a connection, just think of empathy.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Jasmine.
Yeah. Well, and I also think, thinking about your sources too, like who are you citing and how are you citing them?
Point.
I think that's a really big thing that we also saw this year. Are you taking, the PD's word for it, or are you kind of checking in with the community too and seeing what exactly they have to say about whatever issue you're writing about? And I would also say, checking in with your colleagues of color, your Black, like I think last summer was really intense for, Black journalists. I remember crying watching
you
George.
said that.
Yeah, I before work, I remember I cried watching George Floyd's body being taken to St. Louis, and there was like a big kind of memorial service, and I remember watching that and crying, and then running down to 11th and Pine and having to cover it. And so I think that, kind of creating a newsroom for Black reporters, for other reporters of color that is really supportive and advocating for more resources, like mental health resources and hiring of more journalists of color. I think that's like it's a big thing, but I think that's one of what I would recommend to white journalists.
So I have an audience question here from Cam for Naomi. In the spirit of what Omari Salisbury is doing with Converge and the Morning Update, what additional energy are you seeing around the expanding journalistic landscape? What else would you like to see emerge?
Well, I guess I would like to see that all our existing media sources are supported by our community. I say this all the time, but I've got lots of folks in the community who feel it's offensive that we have a paywall for our content. And while I wish there wasn't a paywall, I wish that all media was free. Unfortunately, we don't have a publicly, supported or other stream of support for media at this point. And so I think, supporting the media that exists so that it can continue to exist. The Seattle Times, as well as, pretty much every local media outlet is a fraction of its former self, because we don't have the resources that we did in the past. And each loss of each journalist means a loss of coverage, which means less people looking at holding holding the powerful accountable, but also covering the marginalized communities that most need coverage. So I would say to support the journalists that are there. But I did want to go back and answer the previous question and about white journalists. And I think one of the things that I think is important is that a lot of self-awareness needs to happen that hasn't always happened in the past. Like, so for example, if you are a journalist that has never met or have anyone in your circle who has ever been incarcerated, maybe you're going to have a certain perception around people who are incarcerated where you couldn't see yourself or anyone that you love in that position. And therefore you don't have the same amount of empathy that Kurt's talking about for those folks. And I think those are huge blind spots for journalists, especially those who haven't been exposed to a lot of the things that, we cover all the time. And if that's your experience, then, you should be really circumspect when you're writing about those situations or folks that is their experience, because they're going to have a lived experience that's very different than yours that you might not be able to understand unless you have a lot of humility.
I'd like to just hear something from each of you, like a takeaway, something that from this year that gives you hope that we are changing, we are doing, we are making some progress in the areas that we've been talking about. Jasmine, would you like that one?
Yeah.
I heard a big pause.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a bit hard to assess that for me right now. I think it still feels like we're in such a transitional moment, and it still feels like, again, maybe there's greater awareness around, police brutality and, the connections between policing and white supremacy and, structural issues, and maybe they are, I think kind of having that conversation more out into the fore is always a good thing. But then, again, I think about how hard Manny Ellis's family had to fight to get their case heard, right? And the fact that, watching police trials and police being held accountable, like, Derek Chauvin, it's still a spectacle because it's not common, right? It's really rare. And so I definitely wish I could have like a more sunnier takeaway. And I think we're definitely on the right path, but I still think of it as like this huge hill that we're really trying to climb right now. And we're at the bottom for sure.
Naomi, do you have a takeaway for the road here?
I don't know. I took photos at a protest that happened last summer in the South End. I can't remember the exact number. I think it was like 10,000 people marching from Othello Park down to Rainier Beach. And honestly, I don't think I've ever seen anything like that in my entire life in Seattle, especially not in this area. That many people, it was joyous, it was powerful, it was, I don't know, I felt hopeful. And it was organized by young Black men who would often have been written out in previous, stories of our city. And they led this beautiful march and protest that, I don't know, it just left me feeling like we can do things.
Kurt, 10 seconds, takeaway, positive, forward.
I mean, I do try to always hold on to hope. And as somebody who's biracial and whose parents were married in 1954, and moved to Seattle in 1955, shortly after the Brown versus Board of Education decision, I have to believe that that things can get better, and that in their own way, even though things are very difficult right now, that they are actually better.
Well, thank you all so much. Great discussion. We have been talking with 3 journalists who have been tracking the issue of race and policing here and across the country. Naomi Ishisaka, Kurt Streeter, Jasmyne Keimig. Civic Cocktail will take a summer break and the show returns in the fall. I hope you have a great summer, and thanks so much for watching.